Since the very beginning of the Russia-Ukraine war, one thing has been unmistakably clear. Ukraine is the underdog. With a significantly smaller army, it cannot compete with Russia's enormous manpower, nor can it match the Kremlin's near-limitless stockpiles of tanks, armored vehicles, and other advanced military technology. In fact, Russia's military might is almost unmatched in the region, giving it a commanding advantage on the battlefield. However, while Ukraine faces these overwhelming odds, it has found an unlikely strength: strategic brilliance. Ukraine's military commanders, often outnumbered and outgunned, have consistently shown that they can outthink and outmaneuver their Russian counterparts. In a war where sheer brute force often prevails, Ukraine has turned strategy into its primary weapon. This unconventional approach has kept Ukraine in the fight far longer than anyone could have predicted. By leveraging its knowledge of the local terrain and using its soldiers' tactical intelligence, Ukraine has been able to counter Russia's aggressive advances in ways that confound the Russian military. Despite the vast gap in resources, Ukraine has managed to level the playing field through its superior use of strategy. This is the heart of their fight. Not brute strength, but tactical ingenuity. And it is what has allowed Ukraine to persist in the face of adversity. Make sure to subscribe to our channel for more in-depth insights into the war and strategic analysis. In a conventional war, there are two key players: the aggressor and the defender. The aggressor seeks to invade, and the defender is tasked with protecting their homeland. The defender typically sets up fortified positions along the front lines, while the aggressor relentlessly tries to break through these defenses, inching forward to capture land piece by piece. For centuries, this has been the standard approach to warfare, where territorial advances and losses provide clear indicators of who is winning and who is losing. This age-old method of battle is defined by the infamous front line, where each side digs in, refusing to give up any ground. The hope is that either the defender can hold the line or the attacker can find a way to break through. But this predictability has always favored the side with greater manpower and resources. In Ukraine's case, facing Russia's overwhelming size and firepower, this method was not going to work. Ukraine could not afford to adopt the traditional strategy of simply holding every inch of ground at all costs. The harsh reality was clear. Ukraine was facing an adversary with over 1.1 million active-duty soldiers, over 20,000 tanks, and more than 4,000 artillery pieces, all backed by a defense budget of $65 billion. In contrast, Ukraine had just around 250,000 troops, with far fewer tanks, around 1,000, and a much smaller arsenal. Russia's military might, valued at over $650 billion, was simply insurmountable. If Ukraine adhered to this conventional strategy, there would be no end to the bloodshed. Russia's sheer military strength would inevitably wear down Ukraine's defenses. The situation could easily escalate to a point where Ukraine's capital, Kyiv, would fall, and Russian troops would advance deeper into the heart of the country. But the Ukrainian military quickly realized that their best chance at survival wasn't in fighting for every last inch of land. Instead, they had to rethink their approach. If they continued to simply resist, they would inevitably lose in the long run. Ukraine needed a strategy that would minimize their losses while still denying Russia the victory it so desperately sought. This realization would soon lead to the development of a far more creative and effective tactic, one that would leave Russia trapped and bleeding. Realizing they couldn't afford to fight Russia head-on with brute strength, Ukraine's military strategists developed an approach that would turn Russia's numerical advantage against them. This new tactic, which would soon become known as the bait and bleed strategy, revolved around the idea of luring Russian forces into carefully planned traps. The goal wasn't to hold every inch of ground at all costs, but to make Russia pay dearly for every advance it made. The first step of the bait and bleed strategy was deceptively simple. Ukraine would give up certain areas, but only temporarily. Using their intimate knowledge of the local terrain, Ukrainian forces strategically allowed Russian units to occupy seemingly valuable land. However, this land was carefully selected, often filled with obstacles like mines, trenches, and natural barriers that would later trap the Russians in their pursuit. These areas were designed to appear vulnerable, enticing Russian forces to move in, thinking they had gained an easy victory. Once Russian assault squads, typically consisting of 35 to 50 soldiers, entered these areas, the second phase of the strategy would begin. Ukraine's forces didn't try to hold the land with large concentrated units. Doing so would make them vulnerable to Russian artillery and airstrikes. Instead, small Ukrainian squads would appear to retreat, drawing the Russians further into the trap. At this point, the Russians believed they were on the verge of capturing an important position, their confidence growing. They were playing right into Ukraine's hands. The real horror would come when the Russians were deep within these traps. As they began to settle in and take control of the area, Ukrainian drones, always watching from above, would relay critical information about their position. Ukrainian artillery, hidden in well-protected locations, would then unleash a devastating counterattack, raining down shells on the unsuspecting Russians. The assault would come so swiftly and intensely that Russian forces would have little time to react, finding themselves trapped and under fire from all directions. With this tactical brilliance, Ukraine was turning Russia's strength into a major liability. The Russians, who had once felt invincible, were now walking into a deadly trap they couldn't escape. Every Russian advance became a costly mistake. And as the casualties mounted, Ukraine's strategy continued to prove that smarts could trump sheer force. Once the Russian forces were deep within the areas that Ukraine had strategically abandoned, the stage was set for the most critical phase of the bait and bleed strategy, the counterattack. As the Russian soldiers moved further into what they thought were newly gained positions, Ukraine had already set its trap. The moment the Russians began to settle in, convinced that they had gained an advantage, the Ukrainian military struck with a devastating show of force. The counterattack was always pre-planned. Ukrainian units didn't rely on large exposed groups of soldiers to defend these positions. Instead, they had already positioned artillery, drones, and loitering munitions to strike at the exact moment when the Russians least expected it. With Russian forces spread out, thinking they had secured the area, Ukraine's artillery would fire the first round of devastating mortars and shell blasts, ripping through the Russian ranks before they even had time to comprehend what was happening. To make matters worse for the Russians, Ukraine's drones were constantly providing real-time surveillance of the battlefield. These drones tracked the movements of the Russian assault squads, feeding invaluable intelligence back to Ukrainian forces. The precision of the counterattack was astounding. Ukrainian artillery knew exactly where to target, exploiting every flaw in the Russian positioning. The Russians, who had been confident in their advance moments earlier, were now trapped in a deadly situation. With no time to retreat, they were cut off from reinforcements and struggled to escape the barrage of fire raining down on them. Within minutes, the battlefield had transformed from a Russian success to a Ukrainian kill zone. The cost for Russia was staggering. Thousands of Russian soldiers were killed or wounded in these attacks, and many of their armored vehicles and heavy artillery were destroyed. The deaths and destruction were not just military losses, but symbolic blows to Russia's morale. This was not just a tactical setback, it was a crushing humiliation. For every small gain Russia made, Ukraine responded with precision, leaving the invaders to pay a heavy price for their overconfidence. And this was just the beginning. As Ukrainian forces continued to push back, the Russians were left scrambling, their morale shattered and their losses mounting. It was clear that Russia's costly tactics were backfiring. Ukraine was proving that despite being outmanned and outgunned, it could outsmart its enemy in ways Russia never anticipated. The true brilliance of Ukraine's bait and bleed strategy lies not just in the immediate tactical victories, but in its long-term impact on Russia's ability to sustain its war effort. Each successful counterattack left Russia with devastating losses, both in terms of manpower and morale. The strategy, designed to be both efficient and ruthlessly effective, was turning the tide of the war in ways that no one had expected. Every time a Russian assault team thought they were on the verge of success, they were hit with crushing force. It wasn't just the immediate casualties that would damage Russia's military efforts. It was the profound effects on their soldiers and their ability to keep fighting. In just the first 6 months of 2026, Russia lost over 45,000 troops in failed assault missions, and that number was climbing rapidly. Ukrainian intelligence was able to pinpoint where Russian forces were most vulnerable, striking at the heart of their military structure and leaving them with nothing but decimated ranks. The losses were not just in terms of human life. Russian vehicles, tanks, and artillery, some of their most powerful assets, were being destroyed at an alarming rate. In one particularly brutal engagement in eastern Ukraine, over 200 Russian armored vehicles were destroyed within a 48-hour period. These weren't just ordinary vehicles. They were part of Russia's most advanced arsenal. Tanks like the T-90 and BTR-82s, capable of withstanding most forms of fire, were rendered useless by Ukraine's precise artillery and drone strikes. Russia was losing assets that were worth millions, and these losses were adding up, with no immediate replacements in sight. The real blow to Russia, however, was not just the loss of soldiers and equipment, it was the psychological toll. As these tactical defeats mounted, the Russian military was forced to deal with a growing sense of hopelessness. Soldiers, once eager to push forward, began questioning their purpose in a war that seemed to have no end and no clear victory. In the past, Russia's larger numbers could make up for casualties, but now, with public dissent growing and the pool of willing recruits drying up, maintaining the same level of combat readiness was becoming increasingly difficult. Ukrainian forces, on the other hand, were adapting quickly, using their limited resources efficiently. Their smaller numbers meant they had to be smarter, more strategic, and above all, patient. And as Ukraine's forces continued to reclaim territory, the world began to see the devastating truth. Russia was not only losing soldiers and equipment, it was losing the very will to win. In the long run, these constant setbacks would not only strain Russia's military capabilities, but could also lead to a collapse in morale that would severely hamper their ability to continue the fight. The attrition was no longer just about the battlefield. It was about the spirit of the troops and the resilience of the Russian war machine. Ukraine's success in leveraging its strategic brilliance to counter Russia's overwhelming military power has fundamentally shifted the way modern warfare is understood. The bait and bleed strategy, which initially seemed unorthodox, has proven to be a highly effective way for smaller forces to level the playing field against a larger, more powerful enemy. This approach marks a pivotal moment in the evolution of modern military tactics, demonstrating that brute force alone is no longer enough to secure victory. In the past, wars were often defined by the ability of the aggressor to overwhelm the defender through sheer manpower and firepower. In this traditional framework, the aggressor would use its overwhelming numbers to push through defensive lines, making slow but steady territorial gains. But Ukraine's success has shown that in today's world of advanced technology and precise intelligence, the old doctrine of hold the line at all costs is outdated and deeply flawed. Ukraine's use of drones for surveillance, its precision artillery strikes, and its ability to outthink a larger opponent have transformed the battlefield. For example, in just the first 4 months of 2026, Ukrainian drones destroyed over 300 Russian tanks and vehicles, far surpassing Russia's losses to Ukrainian artillery and airstrikes. Ukraine has shown that smaller forces can dominate if they use intelligence and precision weapons to their advantage. While Russia may have more tanks, more troops, and greater resources, Ukraine has repeatedly shown that intelligence, tactics, and careful planning are just as powerful, if not more so. Looking to the future, this strategy could change the way future wars are fought. Armed with drones, advanced missile systems, and precision-guided weapons, nations with smaller forces could employ similar tactics to take on more powerful adversaries. The modern battlefield is no longer one where sheer numbers determine the outcome. It is now a game of intelligence, adaptability, and surprise. The key to survival lies not in holding the line, but in knowing when to retreat and when to strike with lethal precision. As the war in Ukraine continues, the world is learning that the future of warfare may look very different from the past. Ukraine's success is a stark reminder that in the age of drones and advanced military technology, the battle for victory is no longer decided solely by who has the most soldiers or the most tanks. Instead, it is the side that can outthink and outmaneuver its opponent that will come out on top. The old rules of war are no longer valid, and the world will have to adapt to these new realities. As the war drags on, Ukraine's resilience continues to defy expectations. Despite being outgunned and outmanned, Ukraine has shown the world that strategic thinking can overcome brute strength. The success of Ukraine's bait and bleed strategy has shattered conventional wisdom about warfare, proving that intelligence, precision, and flexibility are far more critical than sheer firepower. Russia, with its vast army of over 1.1 million soldiers and an arsenal worth over $600 billion, continues to suffer staggering losses. In the past year alone, Ukraine has destroyed over 400 Russian armored vehicles, including some of Russia's most advanced tanks like the T-90 and the Armata. This continuous attrition is not just a tactical setback for Russia, it is a psychological blow that erodes morale and raises questions about the future of their military capabilities. The war is far from over, but one thing is clear. Ukraine is rewriting the rules of modern warfare, and Russia's path to victory seems increasingly uncertain. The world is watching as this remarkable tactical war of attrition unfolds.